Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first day of the Shri Research Festival 2021. It's a celebration of ideas and it's hosted by the Economic Society SRCC. I'm Surbi Agarwal and I'll be the host for this session, and we're so thrilled to have all of you here. I'm extremely honored to welcome Mr. Aaditya Dar, our next speaker for today. Sir is a development economist and is currently teaching at the Indian School of Business. He got his PhD from George Washington University, MA from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and BA from University of Delhi. Apart from this, he is a research fellow at Bharati Institute of Public Policy, member of Society for Economics Research in India, and co-organizer of the seminar in Applied Microeconomics. His research interests span from governance, elite formation, and state capacity to agricultural issues, including agricultural trading, markets, and technology. His research examines the social, political, and historical factors that cause and accentuate poverty and how individuals and communities can break away from these social and structural constraints. It's an absolute privilege to have you with us here today, sir. And I would like to welcome you to give us your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I think most importantly with some of the brightest minds in the country. I was not, well, it seems a long time ago that I was at Delhi University. I got my undergraduate from Kirorimal College, not far away from SRCC. And, I remember going to SRCC because we had to get like photocopy of, like they had the best notes apparently in econ. So you had to always go to SRCC. At the time, arts faculty, there used to be a photocopy shop where I used to get like SRCC notes. I don't know if that's still the case, but or at least I don't even know if you guys have been to campus. It seems like with COVID, many of you might be working from home. Okay, so what I want to do today, I thought was just maybe briefly, I wanted to understand like what, young economists in the country feel their role in society should be. And before I tell you about the kind of work that I'm doing and how I think, the kind of questions we should be asking in economics going ahead, I wanted to hear from you first, like, what do you think economics is? And what kind of questions do you find most interesting, or at least what were your motivations perhaps when you started doing economics, so maybe if anybody wants to unmute themselves, people on the panel want to talk about it, or the attendees. Yeah, go ahead, Ananya. Yeah, just feel free to unmute yourself. And
hi, sir. First of all, it's an honor to be here talking to you. I think for me, economics has always been about understanding how consumers take decisions. I think that's the part of economics that intrigues me the most. How do we take the decisions we take? What are factors influencing the decisions we take? So that would be my answer to why I chose economics.
Okay, that's good. Natalie?
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. So personally speaking, what I absolutely love about economics as a subject is the fact that it's a very practical and extremely relatable subject. It's so much so that, all the concepts in theory that you read about, you can also actually see them happening in real life. So that creates a sort of connect for me personally, which, kind of makes me like the subject and also pursue it in the future if possible.
Okay, so if I may ask, like, what kind, like, so, I think the earlier person, I forgot her name, she mentioned about, like the consumer behavior, consumer decision making as one example. What kind of areas do you find to be most practical, where you feel like, this is very interesting? Or at least you find that very interesting.
Personally, I am more into macroeconomics when compared to microeconomics. So just, when even though consumer behavior is something that's more interesting and more relatable at a personal level, but again, when you look at the economy as a whole, and because Incidentally, I'm also from a humanities background. So because I have that sort of bent of mind as well, so that connects well. And, I like to look at the macroeconomic picture and the trade relations to be particular.
Trade relations. Okay, that's good. Yeah, so trade, that's very good. Abhiram, yeah?
Yeah, good evening, sir. So one thing that interests me in economics is its versatility, because you go from all the way from micro level, how individual consumers behave, into the macro level, how countries behave, how different countries together behave, and everything together. So it goes from a very minute level into a very large level. You take the whole world as one scenario. On the other hand, you take how one single person is going to behave very different from what another person behaves, and then finding traces or finding relations or similarities between different groups of individuals. So in a way it goes, so it reaches all levels. So that is something that I find interesting in economics.
Okay, that's good. So these are all useful things that I suspected, and I'm glad that you guys are echoing this. Is anybody from the attendees who wants to mention like their primary motivation for studying economics, or the kind of questions, or maybe like a shortcoming you feel like, oh, I thought economics would be about this, but ye to nahi padhate, like it's about something else. Maybe we can have any one person you can see. Yeah, Ritish, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. So, basically, I pursued my intermediate in science stream, and now I'm pursuing my economics from Punjab University. So, my primary motivation to study economics is that how does the government make decisions regarding, for instance, for instance, GST.
Farm laws.
Actually,
GST is okay.
My grandfather is a chartered accountant, so he is primarily works in indirect taxation. So when the GST came, that how does the
it affects people.
Traders behavior gets changed. They thought that this will be a bad idea, but I think that it's a good idea.
Good idea.
And I'm studying economics because I want to see how the government's decision can affect the citizens. How do the government uses the revenue for the social welfare? How does this all these things happen?
Yeah.
Basically,
yeah. Thanks, Ritish. Yeah, so I was able to
study. Currently, I have. Thank you, sir.
Oops, you're breaking up. Okay. Yeah. This is very good. I think we can have maybe one more response. So we've heard about I think Sana, you can go ahead. We've heard about maybe if that's a price after that, Sana, we can maybe hear from you very quickly. Oh.
So I am pursuing economic honors, and I'm from Kerala. The way economics interests me is that it changes our total outlook towards the society, towards the way we see our society. Everything changes. For example, if we are seeing the budget, how the finance minister has been presenting each and everything, we get the total idea from that, or how it is going to affect the society, how it is affecting the poor, how they are going to meet the debts, everything about the budget deficit, everything. It is really interesting, sir, at some extent.
That's good. So it's good to know. So basically, if I want to summarize, it seems like there's a consensus, at least, that the very common theme in all of what you've said, it's about the market economy in some way or the other. Consumers, could be inflation, unemployment, big picture. It's about the stuff that you would typically ask people, what is economics? And they would say, yeah, it's about how do I reduce poverty, maybe as, or, the impact of GST or some of these economic policies, right? Either big picture or small picture. What I did want to tell you today, at least focus the next maybe 15, 20 minutes just on that aspect is, econ right now, and especially research in economics today, is also pervading different disciplines, right? So there are ways in which economists are beginning to use tools from sociology, from psychology, from political science, trying to ask even more deeper questions about, as individuals, how and why do we behave? And those questions are not necessarily only linked to about what kind of products I'm buying, or as in a more narrow sense about the market economy. So, for example, there was a recent paper about why do, for example, how does sexual harassment on the streets of Delhi impedes women's choices on what colleges they might choose. This is research by, Girija Bolkar, who's now at the World Bank. She's also a student from Delhi University, and she basically finds that women, when they're choosing which college they go to, actually at the back of the mind, either their or their parents, matters how safe the route to college is. And people might give up a very, prestigious college seat because it may not be very close to them, or going to that college might be not very safe. The point I want to make here is, typically, I do not know about how you guys are thinking about this right now, but maybe some time back, like the questions about how sexual harassment or sexual violence interacts with educational choice may not have been in the purview of economics, but now it is. This is just one example of how the discipline of economics is being broadened. And when I had thought about the topic as the role of young economists in today's India, the reason I wanted to mention about why I mentioned today's India is because today's India is also very different. Like, there are a bunch of political economy considerations. You look at the media and how it seems to be echoing a certain point of view. Why does the media behave that way, right? So we are taught that, oh, when there's a lot of competition should give you better quality. But since in the Indian context, too much competition is just giving you terrible quality of news, at least in the TV media, compared to the print media. Why is that the case? What explains the political capture of media? Why does the media only, for example, echo the government side and doesn't show you the entire picture? What are the considerations for some of these factors? These are questions that economists are actually working about. They're looking into under what conditions would we expect the media to just be a propaganda piece? Okay, that's a question now about economics. You might think, oh, but what is economics about here? Well, economics is about the competition. It's about industrial organization. It's about a variety of factors. It has long-term consequences of the health of the democracy of the country, right? So these questions that were earlier outside the purview, perhaps, have been brought inside the purview of econ. And I wanted to spend some time talking about them. And then what I thought I'll do right now is I'll just talk a little bit about my own research, give you a flavor about why this kind of new economics of sorts. The specific field that I study is, well, I study both agriculture and political economy, but I want to talk today about political economy. Okay, so let me go ahead and share some slides, and maybe I'll keep my remarks brief, but I come towards the end, and we can again discuss about, are there limitations with these projects that I'm working on, other ways to extend these, and I can maybe, tell you about what I think, some of the other questions that, people in your shoes might be asked, might want to ask. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen right now. Oops. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a couple of projects that I'm working on. Well, I've worked on in the past, and one of them has got to do with the role of elites. The conventional wisdom is that political elites, if you come from a rich background, you will typically favor economic growth. But if you come from a poor background, you favor redistribution. That's been like the conventional wisdom, so to speak. Why is this an economics question? Well, in a country like India, you can see what happened with the farm laws as well. A lot of policy making is determined by politics. It's not just about simple, economic consideration of the market economy. It's determined by, which groups are kind of more dominant, how they are, bargaining with one another. And in that kind of context, when politics is so central, it's very important to understand truly how economic policy is being made. You want to understand how politicians are being elected. And what I focus on this particular project is to understand the role of how power really operates at the local level in India. And this is an important question because which kind of candidates are elected by political parties will determine the kind of policies those candidates might end up, supporting when they come into power. Now, so far, people have focused on the role of like religion. There's actually very interesting work comparing, whether Muslim MLAs are good or bad compared to, non-Muslim MLAs. The research finds that if you're a minority, politician, then actually you're good for human development. Infant mortality is lower. There's research which compares about the role of female politicians, comparing female politicians to male politicians, asking, what are the policy outcomes when women are elected to office. There's research on lower castes as well, but surprisingly, there's not that much work on class background. So I wanted to just give you one example of these two politicians, Mayawati and Meera Kumar. These are both female politicians. They're both scheduled caste. They're both Dalits. So they have the same gender identity. They're the same caste background, same religion, of course. Incidentally, both of them were at Delhi University as well. Both of them did law, and they both entered politics around the same time in 1983, I believe. But what is distinct about these politicians is their personal background, how they were socialized into politics. Meera Kumar was the daughter of Babu Jagjeevan Ram, who almost became prime minister of the country. And she was an Indian Foreign Service. She was an IFS officer who quit the civil services, and then she was handpicked to fight elections. Not from UP, where Bijnor is where she was originally from, but she was fighting elections in Bihar. On the other hand, Mayawati had spent the last 10 years of her life campaigning, going village to village on a bicycle, on her, with her mentor Kashi Ram, trying to campaign for her political party, the Bahujan Samaj Party. So while these politicians are very similar on identities in terms of religion, gender, ethnicity, they're very distinct when it comes to the personal background. One has this kind of family heritage, and the other has a more grounded approach in politics. So the question is, do we expect these politicians to have different impact, different implications for economic development in their own constituencies? And what this project looks at is, what is the role of a leader's background before the first contest? Like, can we look at their class background and basically correlate? In this case, we try to look at the causal impact of the role of a politician on economic development. And I basically developed these two kind of typologies. One of them is called a parachuter. These are local political elites. So anybody who has a family background, you could be part of a business, be running a successful business, then you quit your business and then you run for office. You're part of the economic elite. In the Indian context, you find cricketers who run for office as well, celebrities. They are part of the social cultural elite. And on the other hand, you have people who have risen from the ranks. They have no prior name recognition advantage. They are student politicians. They could be, like block level or village level, panchayat level leaders who then rise up the ranks. They could be party workers. So those are people, I call climbers. So parachuters are the elite politicians, and the climbers are the non-elite politicians. And what you can see basically are a couple of striking facts. Let me first show you this. This is by the way data for Bihar between 1990 and 2010. So overall, first things first, we find only about 7% of politicians who win office are just women. Okay, so that's one very striking fact, that there is just not enough female representation in office. Only 8% are Muslim. So when it comes to equal proportional representation, even Muslims don't have that. Upper castes, who are just about 15% of the population, are disproportionately represented in office. But the key thing I want you to remember is that these elite politicians, people who come from elite backgrounds, are still 68% of the overall people who win office. And both people who win, and people who lose, 67, are roughly similar. This is saying that 68% of all winners were elites, and this is saying 16% of the people who just came second are also elite. So the entire candidate pool does not represent the average person in India, or at least in the case of Bihar. They come from far more privileged backgrounds, and already you can see a disconnect between the kind of people we're electing into office and the lack of, let's say, the representation of working class politicians at the highest level in state politics. So what I will end up doing then is I basically try to look at can I look at the correlation between a politician and economic growth? And we're not, as economists, not always looking for correlation. We also want to look at causation as well. Can you say that X caused Y? And in my research, I basically find that these elite politicians lead to lower economic growth. And I measure economic growth by at the constituency level using data from satellites. So from outer space in NASA, you can see like how bright the country looks, and you can create a measure of economic growth based on the luminosity, or how bright or how dark a particular constituency is. Because in India, we don't have data at the constituency level. It is very difficult to do research conventionally. So you have to kind of think about different ways of doing this research. And in my research, I find that these elite politicians actually lead to lower economic growth. They lead to lower school construction as well. So it's also leading to lower redistribution. And this entry to a politician's background is perhaps more important. The class background is much more important than ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on and so forth. And the mechanism behind this channel is about corruption. Essentially, what happens at the local level is that these elite politicians try to interfere with the bureaucracy, try to allocate resources that actually favor them, and that process, they end up impeding economic development. So on average, if a climber constituency, a politician with a non-elite background is growing at 6% per annum in terms of like GDP growth rate, the parachuter constituency would be growing at 5.8%. So just one politician in one constituency is knocking off 0.2 percentage point of growth every year, which is a fairly sizable impact for a politician to be having on economic development, right? So this is kind of a project which looks at how economics, or how economics is influenced by politics, and then specifically which kind of people we're electing into office and the role that candidates' class background has. This was just some data trying to show you that there's indeed underlying the politician growth link, politician bureaucratic nexus. I want to talk about now a second project, which now looks at not just the role of these political actors, but the interaction between non-state actors and the economic elite. And this is, I think someone had mentioned the role about traders. Here we ask a question, are there like politician trading links in India? And is there a political price cycle? So I'm not sure if many of you guys are aware of this, but there's this idea of a political business cycle, which is that typically, I think someone had mentioned that interest in macroeconomics, so you expect the business cycle to vary with economic conditions, but in many countries they find this, the ups and downs actually coincide very well with the election cycle. So before elections, there's somewhat more electoral funding, there's conventional boom. After election, things might end up slowing down. In this project, we look for whether the prices of essential commodities in India, whether they correlate with closeness and whether an election is close or not. So I basically find that how much markup traders charge for onions in India is systematically correlated with election. So the closer you are to election, the wedge between what consumers are paying and what the farmers receive, that which is much narrower close to an election compared to when you're further away. And this is this cycle suggests some kind of a link between politicians and traders. And it works in the case of onions because onions is an oligopolistic market structure. It's a structure which has one, where commodities price inelastic. So there is significant amount of demand elsewhere across all sections of the society, and the market structure is such that there are few traders in Maharashtra, in Nasik district, which are able to account for many of these, political considerations. So again, you basically, if I can show you a picture, this is what it looks like. If you're close to an election, this is like distance from an election. If you are like just close to an election, then the prices of onions are much lower. And if you're further away, they're higher. And if you're further away, this is the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year in office. So this is again telling you that only retail prices are lower, but wholesale prices are not. So again, why is that the case? All right. So now, having talked about politician economics, political traders, I want to talk about political criminal contractor links and how that influences economic growth. The question in this project is, how do low-income and conflict-prone societies reduce crime and they transition to a developed society? So for a while, Bihar in the 1990s, 2005 period, well, not just that, actually, even before that, actually starting in the 1980s, had significant amount of gang violence. And the question was, since 2005 in the popular media, if you're paying attention, you get the impression that crime has reduced. And the question was, how did society just go suddenly from like very high violence to one where violence is relatively less? And there are a variety of policy implications for this, because at the end of the day, I think the world's poor, like about 1 billion of them live in contexts which have endemic violence. So understanding how we can control violence is very, very central to understanding how economic development, economic growth, will matter. So what I do in this project is first to show you two things. One, yes, it is indeed the case that in Bihar post-2005, when the new regime came into power, that crime rates have fallen. So organized crime, as measured by rates of dacoity, robbery, kidnapping for ransom, murder, do fall post-2005. So you can look at the year 2005, somewhere over here, and you can see a secular decline after 2005, in these pictures. But it is not just. But that's it. The story is not crime in Bihar all crime in Bihar is reduced. Actually, some other kind of crime, let's say kidnappings overall, thefts, total crime has actually increased, and riots specifically have increased after 2005. So it's not necessarily the conventional media exercise that, Bihar has now resolved the crime story. That's not necessarily the case. What is happening? Well, there's another puzzle that is there, which is that all the criminals who were, there were, I think, 20,000 people were put into prisons for which we have data. Many of the prisoners just spent only 1 year in prison. So the question is, if these were these massive, criminal warlords or gang leaders, why didn't they resume criminal activities when they came out of jail, right? Like, how can suddenly these guys just disappear? And trying to understand this question requires you to go beyond the lens to understand what could possibly be happening. And what I basically find in my research is that there's a correlation between the amount of spending on roads and organized crime. So if you are spending a lot of money in a given area on roads, organized crime declines, but not for other kind of crime. And this is basically suggesting that these criminals were kind of rehabilitated in the construction sector. So they kind of became contractors. So basically earlier, previous criminals are now today's contractors. And these, because they can now do business sort of more legally speaking, they've given up on their existing crime work, and they have now become different. Here's an example of a case study from Katihar, where I'm just trying to document this tag. Up until 2005, there were these 4 major gangs, each belonging to a different caste group. So, they are the upper caste, the Rajputs, the Bhumiyars, the EBCs, and the backward caste. They all had one or the other gang leader who would kind of support their own community's interests. And up until 1995, these criminal groups were engaged in extortion, essentially. And they would kind of provide protection services to contractors in their region of influence. What happened in this 1995-2015 period is there's a kind of a wall of attrition between these various groups, that eventually the rivalry that kind of remains in Katihar, which is this district in eastern Bihar, is between the EBCs and the upper caste. So Shankar Singh belongs to the upper caste, and Avdesh Mandal is one of the extremely backward castes in Bihar. But if you now ask the question, okay, what are members of these gangs doing today? So because post 2005, the regime there was kind of mostly supported by the upper caste. The upper caste kind of criminals became contractors, right? So one of them is involved as a contractor, the other one's involved in a liquor business, someone has become a broker for government work, kind of passing on contracts from one person to the other. However, if you look at the lower caste criminals, they have either been put in jail, or they're doing kind of like more local activities like starting a fish business or becoming like local politicians. But it's interesting that not all criminals were kind of rehabilitated into the construction sector. Only the ones whose base aligned with the base of the ruling party, they were ending up being benefited from this kind of a policy. The point I wanted to make through all of this is essentially that studying economics in India, for all its different, themes that once you talked about, decision making, macro, micro, it's hard not to look at social norms, politics, behavioral stuff, to understand why is it that India is poor today, or why is it that some of our regions in the country are poor today. So I wanted to essentially kind of conclude by saying, if you're thinking about a career in research and economics, and if you ask me the role of what role the young economists should be playing today, I think there's many questions that still have to be answered. For example, what is the role of right-wing politics on just mental health or mental well-being of people? We're in a scenario where there are these debates on WhatsApp, debates elsewhere, where people can't seem to make connections between what realized facts are, and facts don't seem to matter, right? Because everything is being spun on a political narrative. What kind of role can economists play? Is this something that economists can do? Yes. This is one of the most central questions in economics right now, trying to understand how prejudice comes about, the role of social media. Does social media lead to xenophobia? It's it's a very important research question in economics right now. This is just one kind of question that you can begin to ask, and I just wanted to highlight for some of you who may not be as engaged into this kind of thinking, that econ is no longer limited to a more narrow set of questions. A much larger landscape has been opened up by researchers working in political economy, in behavioral economics, and the field of development economics, one that I kind of mostly focus on, is every day being churned into new directions. So with that, I'm going to kind of pause right now, and I thought maybe I can hear from you like what your reactions were, any questions you had for me, or any other feedback or whatever. Just have a kind of more interactive session, going ahead. So thanks once again.
So do you want to take questions from the audience, or should we maybe ask them for their opinions? Or
yeah, I think so. I would like to hear from the audience, I mean, any reactions, if anybody has any questions, clarifications they have, that's always welcome. But if there are ideas that people have, or they're like, oh well, I've been interested in this particular topic, I just don't know how to get started. I'm happy to chat about like what data sets you can use, what opportunities there are there elsewhere. So pretty much any question that you have, for me, is completely fair. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
okay, I think we have someone in the audience. They've raised their hand, so we'll just unmute.
Sure, go ahead, please. So maybe we go with Devansh first.
Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, sir. So, talking about something that I want to start with, and I'm not sure how to. It's I have a real, genuine interest in universal basic income, and I want to know how should I get started, and about the fact that in India there is not much research about it. Meanwhile, there have been experiments outside the country. So, I mean, how should I go about it? Because I genuinely like this subject because it goes towards economics for social welfare, which is what my final goal is, actually, you can say.
Yeah, so if you're familiar, yeah, so you're right. So UBI in India is a bit of a tricky question, just because we just don't have the fiscal space right now to actually execute something like that. But there are various policies, of course, that have been suggested on this topic. I think some of the research that are working in this area are Karthik Muralidharan, he's faculty at University of California, San Diego, Paul Niehaus, and Deep Sukhankar. These three do a lot of work on cash transfers and the PDS system in India. So you can look up their research. Ideas for India had a nice symposium on this exact topic where they had, Pranav Bardhan, I think Maitreesh Ghatak, and a bunch of other folks kind of give their reactions to various proposals. If you're thinking of some kind of a study on this topic, you might want to, like, I mean, it's kind of difficult at this stage, just because you'll have to have people, you have some, if you're thinking of field experiment, you have to give some people some cash, and that requires some amount of, research funding. In the absence of that, what you could do, if you're interested in this overall idea of like how we should deliver our social programs, is look at, for example, the PDS system, how in-kind transfers are happening. So it's not cash transfers, but maybe looking at that will give you both what the current limitations of the PDS system and the current advantages are, which can then help feed into, okay, how I might design the UBI scheme if I have to go about doing that. And that's something that's very easy to do. If you're in Delhi, just go visit a ration shop, just talk to people there. You can develop a small survey, a group of 5 students, you and your friends can say, okay, we want to survey, let's say, interview 50 ration shops, people in those areas, and the dealer themselves, to understand what the various constraints they face, and the various advantages and disadvantages of that kind of of executing of delivering welfare food in this example, via that program. So this again goes back to like what economists should be doing. I think you guys should always be working on the field, trying to talk to as many people as you can in a more systematic approach, and engage with the subject matter much more academically, so that you're able to, via these surveys and kind of applied research, one, just learn more about what is happening around you, but also then be much more productive in any kind of public discourse. So when someone says UBI is good or UBI is bad, you will no longer be borrowing on ideas from everybody else. You'll kind of have your own ideas and say, okay, well, in my experience, given what I'm finding in my own undergraduate research, this is what I find. And these findings either square up or they don't square up with existing research. The main message I want to drive home through this talk was, research is extraordinarily important. And you don't have to be necessarily limited to only one kind of research. The kind of canvas is very, very open when it comes to econ. So does that answer your question completely?
Yeah, it does. Sir, can you just take a minute and write the names, because I wasn't able
Sure,
to.
yeah, I'll just mention the names over here.
Yeah, sure.
God, I'll put them in the chat.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. In fact, I have a couple of links as well for the UBI. I teach that in one of my courses. So I think if you go to my website, there should be like a syllabus for my course called Government, Society, and Business. And there, one section is on UBI. So you'll find a couple of important reading lists there as well. And these are like not all of them are academic articles, so it's easy to kind of capture them. And I'll post most in the chat window. Okay, who else? Tanvi?
Hello, sir. I'm Tanvi
Hi.
from Dayal Singh College, and
Nice to meet you.
your research was actually really like super interesting for me, because I am from Bihar and I have lived there, and I kind of understand the things that go on there. One question that I had is like, as if I'm a first year economics student, so what kind of tools do I need to understand before I start reading research papers, especially related to political economy?
Yeah, so some of the research papers, at least these ones, are going to be fairly technical, and it may not be sort of just looking at the entire paper will be very, very difficult at this stage. But I do want to mention economics have a very kind of a formula way of writing a paper. So the introduction section and the abstract, even without, I think, any training in econ, well, without much, at least with some basic knowledge, you should be fairly easy to read the introduction and the abstract. And it's a very formula. They'll always say, okay, they'll start in the first 2 pages, they'll say, here's what I did, here's why this question is important, here's what I find, and here's how it contributes to the entire literature. And just reading those 2 or 3 of those pages, and you read them multiple papers, you begin to automatically understand, okay, here, that's interesting. People are looking at the role of different kind of policies, how those policies impact politics, how those policies impact economics, and so on and so forth. So I would really highly encourage you to, as intimidating as it might look at the beginning stage, to be able to at least attempt to read some of these papers. Now I understand some of them will be very, very technical, in which case you can look for this journal called the annual reviews. What the annual reviews does is it sort of summarize research across a variety of different things, and that is sometimes much more accessible than the papers themselves. So it's like reading one paper and then realizing how that paper connects to other papers can be very difficult for someone who's just starting off. But if you read a summary, then that's a good that's a good journal to pick up as well. I would also recommend Journal of Economic Literature, JEL. The Journal of Economic Literature also does the same thing. It summarizes. So in fact, there's actually a nice summary on cash versus in-kind transfers for the person who asked the question earlier. They just tell you, okay, here are the arguments for, here are the arguments against, what research is found, and so on and so forth. And the third journal I will say, apart from annual reviews, JEL is JP, which is Journal of Economic Perspectives. And that is written in a much more conversational style. That's just like, kind of how people write a newspaper op-ed, but like much more, I think slightly more academic. So the Journal of Economic Perspectives is much more conversational, much easier to read. And you'll again find a lot of interesting, research being presented over there. So I'll again put them in the chat window, these 3 journals, but I would say you can start off reading those, and then, just reach out to faculty. Oftentimes you'll be surprised how, people are actually interested working with students who have the similar interests. we get constantly a lot of emails. Okay, you know, I want looking for internship here and there. But if you are working in the exact area that's of interest, then there's actually much higher chance that an internship match will actually work out, because people always want to work with people who are actually interested, you know, in similar topics. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, you can maybe ask again.
No, sir. Thank you so much. You are so clear for that.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Who's next? Parineet? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, good. Am I audible?
Yep.
Hi, good evening, sir. So, sir, a lot of your work, as I was going through it, is also based on agriculture and in the general development sector. So I just had a basic doubt, which is especially when we're talking about developing research in the dev sector, a lot of it needs to focus on empirical analysis and, you know, working with different kind of data sets. But when you try looking out for them in the various sources available, I think a large issue is, of course, the availability of good data sets. And I think my question was generally, you know, why do we go ahead and focus on, say, things like controlled experiments, especially when something like, you know, availability of aggregate data is not very feasible. And so that's like my first question. And my second question would again be, you know, with respect to, especially when we're talking about developing models in to be able to, say, assimilate our results and findings. How do we go about doing that, especially when we're talking about, say, a very remote phenomena? So how do we correlate that to the larger theoretical economics and the frameworks that we study?
Okay. The first question is on why experiments and why not just simple data analysis based on existing secondary data. The big thing right now, and I think this is reflected in the Nobel Prize that was awarded this year, and actually even you know, a couple of years ago, is this emphasis on causal relations. So economists are no longer interested in looking at correlations. I mean, you know, there's a paper recently in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is one of the top journals in econ, about does 3G, you know, like 3G internet, does that lead to, does that reduce or increase the confidence in government? You know, and you can say, okay, you know, I can look at 3G internet, where 3G internet is, where 3G internet is not. I can compare those places and I can see what happens. You know, are people supporting the government there or not supporting the government there? And that is a correlation exercise, because there could be so many other things that can also be changing along with, you know, with the role of 3G. How can you really establish that it's just 3G internet and not anything else that led to this particular, you know, confidence or you know, no confidence in the government? And so for that, some of those questions can be done in using secondary data, like part of my research, but sometimes it, you know, you require, you know, like a field experiment. So you know, a field experiment is where you can actually are able to set people in treatment and control groups, and then you can compare them before, after your intervention to see what was the impact of a particular intervention. So let's say you're interested in looking at the role of remedial education or peer mentoring or test scores, that kind of a question. It's not, you know, because like, you know, because peer effects are kind of hard to observe. You know, let's say I team up with, you know, let's say I team up Maithili and Shri together. I can team up Abhiram and Surbi together. And then because I'm doing them randomly, I'm not obviously, the only thing that's changing is the treatment itself. In this case, let's say providing mentoring service. So Maithili provides mentoring services to Shri, Surbi provides mentoring services to Abhiram. And that, because it was done randomly, therefore, I can be assured that if Abhiram's and Shri's scores increase after the intervention, it's driven just by mentoring. It's not driven by the fact that maybe Abhiram was just different to begin with, or maybe one of them, was there. So that's the benefit of field experiments. And field experiments have their own place in development economics. And they're increasingly being used, but there's also plenty of room available for non-experimental research. These quasi-experimental work that exploits these natural experiments, like I was mentioning about. So someone did this study of looking at the impact of, like I was saying, politicians on communal violence in India. Now, you cannot say, okay, I'm going to, take some constituency and I'm going to put a right-wing politician there. And I'm going to compare it with some other constituency. That's just not possible. But what you can do is you can look at close elections. And the idea is that if elections are very, very close, if someone won by, let's say, 100 votes, and on the constituency, right-wing politician lost by 100 votes, then those constituencies are very, very similar, because just the very close election meant that perhaps something else, maybe it rained that day, some people didn't turn out to vote. Something else not related to that particular politician being elected was driving that turnout. And so then you can compare these close elections, which are elections where essentially they were won by random luck, as being treatment controls. So let's say you can compare, okay, what happens in a place where the right-wing politician wins, just barely wins, versus a place where right-wing politician barely loses. And researchers did that, and they actually found that, lo and behold, when you have the Congress party, for example, in office, which they barely win and when they barely lose, communal violence is about, I think, 11 percentage points much lower, right? So you can actually estimate the causal impact of a political party on communal violence. So it's an extremely important policy question, and we have the tools now to do this. So that's just one kind of way in which you can be looking at something like that. So I hope that answers the first question. And the second question, I think, was a more broader one, and correct me if I understood it incorrect, correct me if I'm wrong. What you're basically asking was, how do I, if I go ahead and do my field work, I have some findings, how do I link it up to the theory that I'm seeing in class, or maybe I'm learning elsewhere? And that's not an easy task. That's why people go on to do their PhDs, trying to become better researchers in that aspect. But I think once you get started off, if you're working under supervision of some faculty, maybe that's a good way to, so they can guide you and say, okay, because at this stage, it's going to be almost impossible to know exactly what all these people have said so far and how you're making the contribution. But I think as long as you have an interesting research question, you're pursuing your own independent research under the supervision of some faculty, they can perhaps guide you and say, okay, look at this particular, studies, they found this, their theoretical model is applicable in your scenario. And remember, some research also contests existing theory, right? So you don't have to always say, okay, existing theory says X, but maybe the empirical evidence is completely different. That means we need new theory. So it's perfectly fine, even if you're not all the time able to say, okay, my data is not matching the model. It's okay. Maybe if you have confidence in the data, that the data was done correctly, then the empirical findings perhaps requires new theory to be developed. And that's perhaps something that you can do, but perhaps that can be left for somebody else to do that themselves.
Right. That's great. Thank you so much.
Welcome. So I'm going to, and then if someone mentioned this data thing, I'm going to put some links in the chat so you guys can see some resources about this stuff. It's on my website as well, in case you have any questions. All right. Oh, I see there's some couple of Q&A questions as well.
So I think we can take Matthew's question first, and
okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir. First of all, thank you so much for that PPT, because it really exposed me personally to the, not very mainstream aspects of research, so to say, which are especially important for undergrads like us. So like going to my question, which essentially has two parts. So for the first part, I'm quite interested in research, and I really want to go ahead and pursue a master's in economics. But what really, makes me uncomfortable, to be very honest, is the fact that I can't really spot any sort of, when you look at research as in terms of a career. So that thought kind of makes me uncomfortable, because I don't see anything that's very, that has that has much weight into it.
Yeah.
So that's the first question. And secondly, like the first question essentially, asks for what ways can I divert to so as to, reach something that's better in terms of not just publishing papers and, just research in general. And that brings me to my second question. That is, if because we're all economic students here, so, incentives work quite a lot. So even if there was to be an incentive to pursuing economics as a career field, I think that would suffice. But then, when we also look at how the research, the academic research doesn't reach policymakers, and, it doesn't really amplify into actions which can be measured. So, like, how can that be done? So those are two questions of mine.
Yeah, so good. You're already thinking about thinking as an economist, weighing the costs and benefits of pursuing an academic career. That's that's good, Matli. I do want to clarify a couple of things. One, there is no better time to do econ right now than it has ever been, right? So just on just in terms of, let's say, when I started, and what situations right now, there are so many more opportunities when it just comes to research. Even if you don't want to go, even if you don't want to take an academic path, just with the masters, people can go on to have sort of very fulfilling careers in public policy, crafting, working with governments. It's increasingly common now. A lot of state governments have like some of the other kind of fellowship where you're working in some, district or some CM's office, looking at exactly how policy is being made, and providing sort of analytical support, background support, legislative support to helping, craft that policy in terms of literature review, summarizing, findings, and so on and so forth. So that is definitely happening. I don't know how well those jobs pay, but I remember there was at least an ISB graduate working in Punjab government as well. My sense is like those jobs pay pretty well because they had like an MBA, degree at that time. So short answer to the question is there are a lot more opportunities, not just linked to one kind of work, but through a variety of fields. And so there are kind of like almost like 3 or 4 different kinds. One is this academic track where you either working under some faculty, then going to do a PhD. That track is is very different. And then as faculty, you can either come back and find jobs in India, or you can find jobs in the US. I think the average salary for an assistant professor in the US is about 120K or 100K, just as something you start off with. So in the US, that's not bad. If you come back to India, some schools pay a lot, like some public universities are not as competitive on the market when it comes to salaries of faculty. But now you have a bunch of private universities, Ashoka, Shivnadar, Kriya, ISB, IIMs, and salaries here are actually quite competitive in some cases, as well as the private sector as well, that you would be earning. So that's just to answer the point that academic career can also be at least remunerative, so you don't have to worry about like just making bare ends meet. Like it's no longer the case. Like it's I'm a faculty at a state university, and that is definitely, I understand, not it's not remunerative enough. I completely hear you there. That's the academic track. The policy track can be different. So not everybody has to do a PhD. You can then work in these think tanks that are, now there are many of them, blossoming. There's increasing talk about having a chief economic advisor's office in every state. If that happens, then sort of locally you can be embedded and work there. So there's both opportunities within the government and the non-government, either a kind of an NGO space or in a more like think tank oriented space where you can be working on this. The organizations are NCAER, ICRIER, TERI, all these places. If you're interested in environment, you go in one direction. If you're interested in trade, you can go work in ICRIER, for example. And that's just like the domestic space. And then there's a whole international space of like the World Bank, International Food Policy Research Institute, the United Nations, and so on and so forth. And so, those careers are also actually very, very lucrative because that's all tax-free income at those places. So that's on the policy academic career side. I think I forgot your second question now. Well, second question was about.
Yeah, it was to do with how you can make your research reach policymakers.
Yeah. So that is, of course, like a thing that many, like, is this just a paper that I wrote that is now getting kind of, no one's going to read, or like 10 people are going to read, and what's the policy impact? And that's also changing now, especially there are these organizations like called the International Growth Center, for example. I'll send you the link, IGC. Their job basically is to bridge this divide, right? So because academics are not necessarily the best for like communicating research because they end up doing research. There are places like the IGC which kind of bridge the gap between policymakers and academics. And they ask the question, okay, policymakers, what do you want? Academics, can you answer the question? Here's a platform, help meet. Right. So now we have these initiatives which actually are trying to do something like this. JPAL, for instance, also has like a policy advocacy group. You can look at their, like they'll summarize these policy briefs and say, okay, here's the finding, and then they'll try to like lobby governments to see if they can be done. So one very good example is this research by Tarun Jain and his co-authors, where they found that giving sort of gender sensitized education can actually have very important impacts. They started as a simple field experiment in Haryana, and the study was done, got published in the AER, which is like the best journal in econ right now. Tarun is a faculty at IIM Ahmedabad. And now that same policy, because we can see the impact is so huge, the JPAL advocacy team is taking that to states like Punjab and saying, okay, hey, are you interested in this? And I was like, yeah, we actually want to execute this, right? So here's so oftentimes, because things are happening kind of as we speak, like they don't make their way to the public discourse, but things for people who are in the sector are actually evolving at a very fast pace. So, so I encourage you to reach out to faculty or people on Twitter, Econ Twitter, Econ Advisor, to kind of hashtags that you can follow. Just feel free to ask people. People sometimes end up replying if you may or may not be aware of certain things, and you're at two minds. Okay, I'm taking the private sector job and have this option. Where should I go? I'm really interested in this. Maybe there's some information that you do not know that can actually help you make a more informed decision.
Thank you so much, sir. That helps a lot. Yeah. Although I'd say that, it's a proper catch-22 for me, given the fact that, when you get into research, it's probably, getting into think tanks or becoming a professor, so to say. And, I see that to be the last thing I'd want to do. So that becomes a proper catch-22. But yeah, I mean, it does. Your reply does open up a lot of, different arrays that I could probably look at. So thank you so much.
Yeah, look, I mean, when if you had asked me if I was going to, do research when I was an undergrad, even actually up until my PhD, like I didn't even, like in undergrad, would I do a PhD? I would have probably say, that just sounds like who does a PhD? But, it's just about what I realized, actually, this is my experience was, I was working in this, in this private sector organization where I was asking interesting questions, but I couldn't take them to fruition. Like I would, we would, the client was interested in a particular question. I was saying, okay, here's a question. Here's how the health situation happens in Jharkhand. Report there, and then end of story. And so I could not like take it further ahead, even though I could see this interesting loophole there. But the client was like, no, we're done. Project over. Go to the new project. And that's how some consulting works. A lot of these things work. And I felt kind of, well, I actually want to kind of go further. And that requires you to be doing your own research, right? Because you can, the main, I guess, seduction about academia is, I don't know of a job where you have such intellectual freedom, right? You can literally get up and say, okay, I want to work today on X, and there's nothing stopping you. You can't do that in any other job. Oftentimes, and I meet friends, they're all with the time cribbing, saying, "Oh, I hate my job. I hate very few people like the job, and academia is one of the places which does that. It's not all rosy, I don't mean to suggest that everything is hunky dory. We have our own limitations, but cost benefits trade the two off.
Thank you so much.
So let's look at the Q&A.
Yes. Do you want me to read out the question? Or?
Yeah, I'm looking at Kriti. My question is: China's recent actions like crackdown on big tech companies, online tuition, social media, can provide insights and reasons, implications. Oh, brilliant question. Oh man, I have so much to say on this topic because it is, in a way, it's kind of what's happening in India as well, but like in a different, a slightly different way. There's this project by Gary King. Okay, it's absolutely fantastic. What these guys are doing, they were actually working with Chinese social media. The analogous of Twitter in China is like Weibo and a bunch of other social media websites, and they were working to analyze what kind of tweets are posted in on the social media platforms. As they were downloading these tweets and they're going back to them, these guys realized that some of the tweets were not being the links are broken. Okay, what these researchers stumbled on is that they were downloading tweets before they were being censored by the Communist Party. All right, so these researchers now had access to a data set which said, here's what got posted and here's what got censored. Okay, and in China, censorship works by like there are people manually, like you and I sitting like manually and saying, okay, accept, reject. Like it's not like an automated AI. So, it's actually so now you have a window for the first time to know what gets censored. All right, and the key thing that these guys found out, it's insight into how propaganda works, is that if you criticize the prime minister or whatever, that doesn't get censored. That's fine. You can criticize the whatever Communist Party, Xi Jinping or whoever. What gets censored is if you say, hey guys, let's meet on so and so place to protest against the government, right? So if you censor everything black and white, then people are going to stand up against you. But a more sophisticated form of propaganda, censors only collective action, not criticism, right? So this kind of insight, it's like, oh, it's kind of basic, but for researchers to say that it's actually happening as we speak gives you much, just significant amount of insight in compared to other contexts, right? I mean, you can see that happening in other countries, where we have authoritarian governments, of how this propaganda works. So I know your question is a bit different, but the point is that it has implications, and the implications on these crackdowns on economic growth is a very exciting area of research right now. One of the biggest things people are working right now is how conflict reduces trust amongst people. It breaks down civic relationships, and that leads to massive impacts on economic growth, right? So how come, some societies are so poor and they're unable to come out of that low equilibrium? That low equilibrium is sustained because I don't trust you, right? And that happens because we'll have constant communal violence, constant, every day. If I talk about Hindu Muslim, on television, it's going to lead to breakdown of civil ties, right? So the same things that you are seeing happening in other countries are happening as we speak in India right now. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, and especially young folks, to work on some of these topics, right? So my philosophy is, you could be on either side. You could be like, pro-government, anti-government. Just go ahead and collect the data. Get your facts right. Don't just base it based on something that you've heard or something that is incorrect. And you'll be surprised how much the ground reality is very different from what reality you might be open to. So if you ask me for insights and implications that have on the economy, I think it's going to have devastating implications. That's just my view there. But again, like, I think this is like a very active area of research, and I can again suggest some names. Social media, Maria. Yeah, I think there was a Maria Petro. I'll send the link in the chat if you're interested in people who are working on something on similar topics. Okay. Raj, can we get the PPT? Yeah, sure. Happy to share the PPT with you guys. So I can send it to Niyati, and I don't know how it will be shared, but
so you can send it to us. We'll download the attendance list and send it to all the attendees. So that won't be an issue.
Good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yep.
Thank you so much, sir. I think I speak for everyone here that this was supremely enriching, and I think we got to know about a lot of different things. It wasn't, I mean, just like we were, I think it was amazing to say the least. And thank you so much for taking out your valuable time and coming and speaking to us. And thank you so much. And we'll have our next session at 8 p.m. So we hope to see you guys there.
Yeah, sounds good. Just, I'm on Twitter. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And just, good luck for the rest of your festival. All the best. See you. Bye.
Thank you so much.